Welcome everyone. Welcome to City Futures Research Centre seminar series. I'm Dr. Ganguli, and I'd like to acknowledge today we are meeting on the traditional land of the Bidjigal people, the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the others past and present, as well as the First Nations people that are joining us today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Fitty, Professor Fitty. But first, some housekeeping. If you're joining online, can you please just mute your microphone, turn off your camera during the presentation, and then when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to send these back on, then you're welcome to do so. You can also put a question into the chat, and my associate Bala will be monitoring the chat for questions. I'd now like to introduce Professor Chris Petit. He's the Director of City Futures, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Richard. Welcome everyone to City Futures, either physical or virtual. It's my great honour to welcome Dr. Laurence Troy and Dr. Rupa Ganguli, both who are very good friends of City Futures. Both have spent some time here working with us at City Futures, still working with Bill, Professor Bill Randolph, as you can tell by the slides, who is online. He should be here introducing, but he's online attending, so maneuvering there, Bill. Laurence and Rupa are at University of Sydney, so working on this ARC grant and other collaborations. So Laurence is a senior lecturer in urbanism in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning, University of Sydney, and he has a range of related interests in urban renewal, value uplift, looking at social housing and funding models, etc. There's a lot there that you can read about Laurence's expertise, and we'll hear more from Laurence very soon. And Rupa is a postdoctoral research associate at University of Sydney, working on this ARC project, A Precarious City, the suburban settlement in the age of uncertainty, with Laurence and Bill. And I really like the title of Rupa's PhD, which he completed in 2022, Chameleons in the City, an institutional analysis of sales agents in Sydney's new apartment market. So I'll hand over to Laurence and Rupa.
Thank you, Chris. Today's title is probably a little bit ambitious because we're still working it out. So the whole kind of spatial reordering question and linking to urban citizenship is still very much a work in progress. So hopefully it'll sort of make sense by the end, but we'll probably leave a little bit hanging, and this is where questions and so on can probably help us out a fair bit. So just before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people whose land we are on today. All right. So there's a number of parts here. Rupa's going to take over at some point, but I'm going to sort of start by mapping out, I guess, where the project came from and how we started thinking about it, and part of it, I guess, the conceptual project of how it's evolved and how we're trying to assemble the pieces together. So in setting the scene for what we're talking about, I guess the launch off point is around this idea of social citizenship and the welfare state. And these are kind of well-worn quotes that talk about this idea of social citizenship, and I'll come to why it's sort of important in a second. But at its base is this idea that you need to satisfy basic levels of your economic existence before you can enjoy the full range of rights and freedoms that come along with being a citizen. So, you know, Waldron's quote at the bottom, without adequate conditions for the use of freedom, what is the value of freedom? And the reason why I start off with this is these ideas about citizenship are deeply entwined with the emergence of the welfare state in that kind of post-war period. And it happened in different ways globally. And you see a very kind of concrete expression of this in, you know, right at the end of the war, when we're talking about housing, in, you know, basically attaching housing in particular to a kind of a key right of citizens. And so this starts to set up the ideas and the approach to how we think about housing and all kinds of other issues. Obviously, education, health are all important dimensions of the welfare state. Now, this emerged in different ways globally. We may have heard of the three worlds of welfare capitalism, mapping out this kind of broad three different types of how the welfare state emerged in this period. And this is possibly a fourth, which it's a well-known sort of text written by Francis Castles, who coined the term, and he suggested this was in application to Australia and New Zealand as the wage earners welfare state. And really what that was about is, what defined our access to things like education and health and housing. Importantly here, the access to kind of welfare state benefits really depended on being a wage earner. We had this sort of relatively low spend in that kind of direct provision of the welfare state compared to some other countries, but we maintained high wages. Now, part of that was a kind of compact between labour and capital around taxation and how we might tax the kind of the capitalist part of the state. And so we had institutions like the wage arbitration system that were a kind of key dimension of enabling this thing to happen over the post-war period. And so it's these kind of relationships that were built up that really define the shape of the kind of welfare state. And as Frank Carstens points out, it was deeply entwined with the capacity of working class households to go out and secure mortgages to pay for housing. So the key argument here is actually the housing model we built up over a long period of time actually meant that labour markets and what was happening within labour markets became deeply intrinsic to housing equality and housing outcomes. Now, of course, there are other moments in this story, not least of which, the election of the Menzies government and in place for quite some period of time in really shaping or solidifying some of these arrangements. And so I guess the argument here is that housing through this period actually became deeply embedded in ideas about rights of citizens. It was deeply embedded in how we imagined the broad shape of society. So the forgotten people is a very kind of famous speech that Menzies made, kind of mapping this out. And it was also linked to the kind of model economy that emerged in this period, the kind of Keynesian economic expansion, the mass consumer industrial society, and housing was a key part of that. And this is a kind of story that also emerged in, the North Americas and so on, where, having housing to fill up with new goods became a kind of key driver of economic growth during this whole period, during the long boom. So other people talk about these kinds of arrangements as a kind of the Australian settlement. Paul Kelly, the political commentator, talks about this kind of social economic compact. And Brendan Gleeson kind of brings this together in talking about the emergence of the Australian suburbs in this period and making that connection between the Australian social settlement and the emergence of the kind of suburbs that we had in this period. So he talks about the Australian suburban settlement. It's a kind of socio-economic spatial arrangement, if you like. So the Australian settlement was a stabilising order with deep foundations in the cities and their suburbs and contributed immensely to the strength of the nation's urban settlements and its healthy growth of its offspring, the suburbs. So in this way, makes the argument that actually suburban growth was a key moment in kind of wealth redistribution and the maintenance of the welfare state during this period. Of course, part of the argument here is as these things start to unravel, we start to see a change in these relationships. So in the 1980s, Brendan talks about the great unsettling and the demise of this kind of social compact, the breakup of the wage arbitration system, the liberalisation of finance, liberalisation of the economy, and inserting into the kind of global economic arrangements. So it's not surprising, therefore, that the compact's demise marked the beginning of the great unsettling of the Australian cities and suburbs. So this is the kind of, I guess, the launch point for where we wanted to this project kind of begins, is that moment of unraveling with the idea that, I guess, a key arrangement here is this relationship between labour markets, economic security, social citizenship, and housing. So how do we take this forward in the kind of post-80s, post-90s kind of moment and try to understand what is the city that emerges to replace this, that reflects these kind of new emergent relationships? So how we are thinking about it, and this is kind of the conceptual piece, is to start to map out precarity across 4 different dimensions. And the reason we're talking about precarity, really, I guess the word crept in thinking about Guy Standing's work on the precariat, which I'll come back to in a second. But there is a whole range of literature that talks about precarity in other kinds of ways, which I'll work through now. So we have, in effect, 4 different realms of precarity that we want to talk about. And the first is housing. And there are multiple dimensions to this. So in kind of marking out the decline of that post-war compact, we can read changes in home ownership very strongly into this. And I just wanted to point out, as we've moved from housing as being a kind of wealth redistribution mechanism, it's now increasingly a kind of wealth concentrating mechanism. This bar at the far left of the chart just kind of emphasises what's happening. So that's showing that the bottom income quintile of younger cohorts, over 60% were in home ownership in 1981, which is really sort of amazing in a whole lot of ways, and that's dropped to 20%. So there is a difference in experience here in that kind of change in home ownership, change in housing pathways, but it's accentuated at different ends of the income spectrum. So within the literature, we're also hearing about terms like generation rent, new, perhaps emergent generation of people that will find themselves in rental in perpetuity. And this is going together with conversations about tenant insecurity and ontological security in housing. Unaffordability is a kind of key pressure and talking point at the moment. High housing cost, rental stress. Also housing quality is as a kind of emergent issue. And this is obviously going together with housing market restructuring. So there's a kind of broad policy shift from home ownership as the emphasis to property ownership more broadly. And, you know, the emergence of a kind of investor grade, quote unquote, housing kind of development stock linked to the availability of tax concessions and so on. So this is a little chart I've just dragged out of Alan Kohler's recent quarterly essay. And if you haven't read it, it's quite a good read. There's a few points that probably disagree on, but it's still very interesting. And one of the things he really paints a stark picture around is the kind of the emergence of the speculator or speculative housing in the context of the last 30 years. And you can almost pinpoint the moment that they introduce capital gain discounts into housing. And we see this divergence almost immediately between house prices and incomes. But so this is kind of catalysed or being part of the whole restructuring in housing markets. So this is the quote from that essay. Whereas the rest of the world, in the rest of the world, investing in real estate was all about getting rental income from tenants. In Australia, it's about getting income tax deductions and then a capital gain. And that really just, highlights what the gain is here. So the second realm of precarity we're thinking around is this one of economic precarity. And this is linked to changes in labour markets. So it gets described in different kinds of ways, but this kind of labour market dualisation is a bit of a kind of catch-all, where we have sort of insiders, outsiders, good jobs, bad jobs. And I guess it's contrasted between the kind of previous, more dominant model of employment, which was sort of structured full-time, permanent, perhaps with career progression, towards this more non-standard, so unstructured, lower skilled, short-term contract, and so on. So it's probably not a strict binary in the dualisation sense. It's probably more on a spectrum of things. But you know, we get the idea of this kind of shift. It's also a conversation about, you know, labour market restructuring in the context of the neoliberalisation of policy and of the economy. So growth in particular kinds of employment, the weakening of industrial relations laws, economic liberalisation. These are all things that are radically kind of reshaping labour markets and the kind of jobs that are out there. And of course, the technological kind of disruptions and the emergence of gig worker in that context as well. So this is all part and parcel of what Guy Standing calls, you know, the emergence of precariat. So a new class characterised by economic insecurity, detached from all norms of labour markets, and so on. So non-standard employment is a kind of key term here, which in Australia account for nearly half of all jobs now. With particular impacts, like there's a higher rate of this amongst women and amongst young people. So the third is the role of family, which we're terming familial precarity. But key here is like there's now an increasing dependence on family and family networks in housing pathways or securing housing pathways. Colleagues at City Uni talk about the asset economy and the emergence of, I guess, new class realities forming around property ownership. And I guess a key dimension of that is then how it's passed on across generations. And so increasingly your trajectory gets defined by your family's wealth broadly, but in particular, ownership of housing and property wealth. And finally, the fourth dimension is around spatial precarity. We all should be quite familiar here about the kind of suburbanisation of disadvantage concept, the kind of urban inversion, the whole with gentrification of the core and kind of moving disadvantaged people out into less advantaged areas. And this goes part and parcel with, you know, what Brendan Gleason was talking about in terms of the changing structure of the state in a lot of these places, withdrawal of services and concentration into particular locations. And this goes together with changing labour markets, the kinds of employment and where that's located in the city. So there is a kind of real spatial dimension going on here. So I should explain this map. So that's the dominant tenure in 2001, which was, so if you did owning, purchasing, renting, what's the most of each of those three? And owning it's the big pink area. And then to 2016, I haven't done it for 2021. It's been that long that I've been doing these things. You know, rental starts to take on a much greater presence in this context, and then mortgaged home ownership is on the fringe. It's another big dimension to it. But outright ownership is now in very much kind of the minority in across Sydney. And if we just quickly look at this across, you know, combine this with a dwelling typology for younger households. So what dominates in the kind of outer areas is that owned house, which is sort of a typical story in some respects. But in that core zone, it's the kind of rented apartment becomes the dominant housing tenure relationship for younger people. So what's this project about? It's really about how these things all overlap, how they intersect. So how housing precarity is intersecting with economic and family and spatial and so on. And I guess the argument here is that they will intersect in some ways. You know, people right in the middle of that Venn diagram, I guess, are probably, you know, not doing very well at all, but some may be spatially precarious or housing precarious, but not against these other things. So it's about how these are going together, how it's driving a kind of urban restructuring and reshaping our ideas of urban citizenship. So how are we starting to interrogate some of this? So I'm going to talk about, this is not the complete project, but some of the first wave of things that we're doing. So to try and, I guess, broadly understand how these things start to go together, we pulled a lot of information out of census and tried to match up some of these census variables against these realms of precarity. I'm not going to explain them all, but just there they are very quickly. So principal component analysis, basically trying to understand a little bit how they cluster and then map it and how it gets expressed spatially. So we've come up with these kind of 5 clusters, which I'll loosely describe. So suburban migrant battlers, which are defined by lower skilled employment, part-time employment, Middle Eastern Asian backgrounds, often in overcrowded houses. Group 2 is this kind of young singles, sharers, and homies. So it's the younger part of the cohort, unmarried, often overcrowded, often renting. In Melbourne, there was a significant loading into apartment living. I should have said we did this across Sydney and Melbourne, with people from Southeast Asian backgrounds. In Sydney, there was a moderate loading into people living in the family home. So these are the kind of homey crowd, young people that were still living at home. 3, suburban aspirational migrants. So average incomes, vocational trade qualifications, Asian background, but slightly different geography. The 4th grouping is apartment renters from more European backgrounds, so Anglo-European backgrounds, independent households, and in Melbourne, this was associated with more professional occupations. So in Melbourne and Sydney, there was a split in this last one, and they actually statistically are the opposites of each other, which is kind of interesting in its own way. So we have on the left, which was what came out in Sydney, was the professional skilled migrant crowd. So in professional occupations from Asian and particularly North Asian backgrounds, more likely to have university qualifications. And negatively, which means, defined by the absence of Australian-born people. And the 5B, which came out in Melbourne, was, which we're calling the kind of suburban Aussie tradies, Australian born background, vocational qualifications, technical and trade employment. And negatively against Asian backgrounds. So, their negative scores were almost identical in their positives for these 2, if that makes sense. And spatially, it makes a lot of sense when we start to look at it. Some of those colours are a bit washed out on the big screen. So to start with the suburban migrant battler crowd, this lines up with spaces that we kind of would expect. It's the southwest of Sydney. So reminder, it's particular parts of Asia as a kind of defining trait, and low skilled employment, lower wage, and so on. The professional skilled migrant, that kind of northern part of Sydney, with tertiary qualifications, so a different kind of migrant grouping. There's kind of 3 different migrant clusters emerging here. There's young singles, sharers, and homies are kind of mixed in those mid-ring older suburbs across, particularly in the west and a bit south in Sydney. So this is possibly reflecting kids of previous generation, working class households. And then the apartment renters kind of cluster into the more wealthy east. And it's a similar kind of geography in Sydney, in Melbourne. The key difference here is around this suburban Aussie tradie, which is very much this kind of down the Frankston Peninsula and out to the east of Melbourne. So if you did map that in Sydney, it would have this kind of Northern Beaches vibe to it. It's sort of, hence the kind of tradie term, I think. So I'm going to hand over to Rupa. We'll try and bring these back together again in a moment. Rupa's going to talk about a survey we've just run. Hopefully we have enough time to get through it all.
This is building on the census analysis, and Alan Jenner's on the call. He kindly provided some customised data on millennials specifically. So we conducted a survey of millennials in Sydney and Melbourne last year, and asked questions that related to each realm of precarity. I'll present some of the findings. So first, I'll explain how we define the different realms of precarity and the questions that related to them. In the housing precarity realm, we asked about their tenure, and we demarcated the groups between precarious and non-precarious. So on the table, you'll see basically with sort of private and informal renters related to their tenure, precarity, then high degree of housing affordability related to the precarity related to unaffordability or housing stress, frequency of movement, ontological insecurity in their housing situation, and also dissatisfaction with their housing situation with specific reasons relating to small size, cost, poor quality amenity, and insecurity. In the familial precarity realm, we built on census questions by asking about access to inheritance, gifts or loans, whether or not their parents owned their housing assets together or separately. And interestingly, in the survey, there's two separate groups of millennials emerged. A smaller group of around 20% of home dwellers or homies, which connected with the census principal component analysis. And we asked whether or not they expected support from their family or parents to be able to live independently. And amongst a much larger group of independent dwellers, we asked about what sorts of support they received from their parents or family to be able to move out. And then amongst the aspirational home buyers, what sort of expectation of support they were seeking, and then the lower household income groups essentially to be classified as being more precarious. And then in the economic precarity realm, we asked 12, we sort of included 12 variables. Not all of them are shown on the table, but it'll make sense when I get to the chart. Essentially, anyone precarious had lower levels of educational qualifications. They were not in full-time employment. They were they were not in continuing employment contracts, so they were in fixed-term casual contracts. And they were underemployed, so they were wanting to increase their number of work hours, but were not able to do so at the time of the survey. They had lower personal incomes. They didn't receive paid leave. They had sort of ontological insecurity in their current employment situation and had low cash reserves. And finally, spatial precarity related to their proximity or their place of residence and its access to job-dense areas. And thanks to SGS, that they provided us with the EJD scores at a sort of suburb level, which we've used for the analysis as well. And you can go to their website and to try and understand the exact methodology of it. But essentially, the EJD high scores relate to CBD centres of each city, and then the scores diminish as we move further out of each city. And in our analysis, we treat spatial precarity as people living in the bottom, in areas with low, in the bottom two quintiles of the EJD distribution. What did the results show? And I'll go through sort of housing, familial, economic, and spatial in that sort of logical order. So turning first to housing precarity, so these are the number of millennials in precarity and across the 6 different variables that we've used to measure, to sort of investigate their level of precarity. And unsurprisingly, private and informal renters stand out. And then next in magnitude were renters in rental stress, higher feeling of insecurity in housing, more frequent moves in and out of housing in the previous 5 years, housing dissatisfied, and amongst a group of purchasers, purchases and mortgage stress. Now, what we did for each of the precarity realms is try to score the millennials based on their presence across one or multiple variables within each realm. So essentially, anyone with a low score were only precarious in one particular variable, and higher scoring were mentioned multiple. They were precarious across multiple variables within that realm. That same sort of logic applies across the 3 realms. So in this chart, we're looking at the 10-year split, as you would expect. Renters scored sort of had high precarity scores compared to owner purchasers, reflecting their tenure precarity. And then even though we sort of related, and this goes back to sort of the institutional structuring of housing supply and how it slots in housing precarious, millennials living in apartments had relatively high housing precarity scores as well. Then turning to familial precarity, this sort of the order of magnitude of millennials by the different measures. So most of the millennials surveyed mentioned they hadn't received any sort of cash injections in the form of inheritances, gifts, or loans, and they had relied on their family or parental support to be able to move out of home, and they had lower household incomes. And then amongst home dwellers at the other end of the spectrum, they also expected some sort of support to be able to move out of home. Similarly, we scored the millennials by whether or not they'd received support, and basically millennials with the higher scores had not been provided with any sort of familial or parental support if they'd moved out of home. And then looking at sort of that tenure split between access to familial support, clearly, renters are not able to get any sort of assistance, sort of demonstrating their sort of relatively high degree of housing precarity. And then it was interesting that both renters and owner-occupiers, owner purchasers, did mention various types of support. Renters relied on payment of a rental bond or contribution to a rental payment, and this includes home dwellers expecting some sort of support to move out and live independently, but also independent dwellers who had moved out and had been provided with some sort of support. And then we ran sort of chi-squared tests of independence to kind of understand the degree of overlapping of those realms. So first, looking at the interaction between housing and familial precarity, it was interesting that housing precarity was statistically associated in small and in medium sort of strength terms with lower household income, no provision of familial support to live independently, parents not having any housing assets, non-receipt of any sort of cash injections in the form of gifts or loans, and no expectation of familial support to be able to buy a home in the next 5 years. And it was sort of the polar opposite amongst the non-precarious housing tenure group. They had higher household incomes, were expecting support and had received support. Their parents were more likely to own their own homes and draw on the equity of their own housing assets, and they had received some sort of one-off payments. Now, turning to the third realm, economic precarity, surprisingly, but also unsurprisingly, connecting with Laurence's earlier discussion on sort of dualisation of labour markets, the gig economy, emergence of the gig economy, I suppose the largest economically precarious group mentioned that they weren't on continuing contract roles. They also had limited access to non-housing assets or investments, maybe superannuation only or no superannuation with other forms of assets and investments. They were underemployed. They had lower personal incomes. Their incomes varied by more than 5% on a weekly basis. They were not full-time employed. They didn't receive the other sort of employment benefits associated with full-time employment and secure employment. Excuse me. Again, looking at the scores, distribution of scores by employment contract status, essentially the non-precarious, the people on millennials on continuing contract roles had low economic precarity scores, because conversely, millennials not in continuing contract roles had higher economic precarity scores. And then similarly, non-precarious group who held superannuation and one or multiple other housing assets or investments had higher economic precarity scores. And there's a converse case for precarious group. So again, we ran the sort of chi-square test of independence. We looked at, well, what's the overlap statistical sort of association between housing and economic precarity. And precarious housing tenure was associated with not being in full-time employment, but also in not being in continuing contract positions, low personal income, low access to cash reserves, being underemployed, wanting to work more at the time of the survey, but not able to do so, and no access to paid leave. And again, it was a sort of the converse case for the precarious housing tenure group owners, purchasers, and public renters who were more likely to be employed full time on continuing contracts, have higher cash reserves, higher personal incomes, have greater ontological feelings of security in their employment position. And in fact, there was a strong correlation between that ontological insecurity in the job situation and housing situation as well in the data. In fact, they wanted to decrease their hours or didn't want any change in hours, so they were their hours were well utilised and they were receiving paid leave. And then finally, turning to the spatial precarity, essentially we treated millennials in that bottom 2 quintiles of the EJD score distribution as being spatially precarious and having lower access to job dense areas, the residents not having access to job dense areas. And it was interesting that actually, and this shows the tenure split of precarious versus non-precarious spatial groups, and renters actually was a higher overall across both tenures. There was a high proportion of millennials living in non-precarious areas. So access to jobs and job dense areas was clearly important for this age cohort, but renters were even more so in sort of non-precarious spatial areas. So perhaps, that sort of, are they making a trade-off between housing and spatial precarity? And is the housing market kind of slotting in the construction of apartments, in the sort of housing construction industry, slotting in housing and economic precarity? Again, we sort of tried to look at the statistical significant association between the spatial precarity and the other 3 realms of precarity, and what emerged was that spatial precarity was associated with being associated with housing unaffordability, frequent, not being able to move frequently, being stuck in their sort of housing economic situation, having no aspirations to buy a home in the next 5 years, and having lower human capital education populations. We also, and this is work in progress, we've looked at sort of the statistical association of the 4 realms of precarity and the characteristics of millennials. So migrants, and their gender status. The gender status is work in progress, but compared to the gender divide, what's emerged strongly in the survey data, which overlaps with the earlier census analysis, is that migrants are more likely to be present across multiple realms of precarity. So in comparison with non-migrants, migrants are more likely to be living in precarious housing tenure, experiencing rental stress, and frequently moving homes. And the familial precarity round, they're less likely to have parents who own housing assets, not receive cash injections, not receive parental support to live independently. They don't expect to receive financial support or any other support to be able to buy a home in the next 5 years, and they live in low-income households. And finally, in the economic precarity, they're more likely to be in sort of fixed-term contract casual type work and underemployed and labor. So this is work in progress, and I'll hand over to Laurence. We'll wrap up, and we look forward to your feedback and questions.
So what does it mean? A bit not sure at the minute. Something fair to say we're probably struggling with slightly is, I guess we're trying to move the housing conversation beyond this kind of fairly small space in some respects around housing policy and say, well, actually, there are a lot of other intersecting issues going on here, and how do we start to think about how they overlap and combine questions of economic security, of wealth accumulation amongst families, and how these things go together in different ways is something we're kind of struggling through, if you like. So there was a lot of information presented there, and in some ways what we're about to say is a little bit tenuous because we're still working on it. So I guess trying to bring it back to the main thrust of the project around, I guess, the breakdown of this Australian suburban settlement idea and what's emerging in its place. Well, I think the first point is actually that suburban settlement is still alive and well in some places for some people. It's still defined, at least partially, by having a good job. So having access to that continuous secure employment seems to be a good, a strong feature of being in that kind of probably mostly suburban home ownership, but certainly home ownership generally. But I guess the caveat around that is access to this is increasingly seems to be determined by access to family support, family network, family wealth. And probably a lot of these families have benefited from the, the gains of that post-war kind of prosperity period, or have just been lucky winners in the spatial lottery of housing, which I think is something to come up that phrase a couple of weeks ago. The second issue, and this is the kind of, I guess, the bit we're trying to nail down, is around how this is being hard-coded into the city. And there's some evidence that it is kind of, driving these spatially nuanced outcomes. So tenure and dwelling structure are key features in this kind of precarity matrix. So home ownership is still, like detached home ownership is still kind of core feature, whereas the apartment rental as the kind of becomes the opposite point of that. And there is a spatial dimension to it. So the absence of this kind of spatial precarity measures seems to, in driving some of these other outcomes, seems to reflect that, well, actually we're building up a city, think about where those rented apartments are being constructed, and they're in spaces that possibly allow that, access to those job-rich markets, but it's still, it's not, just because you can access it doesn't mean you are necessarily benefiting from, in economic terms from that. But I guess it gets expressed in how the city is built up and emerges out of it, and those kind of suburban spaces that still exist within that. So it is kind of reflecting, there are the existing patterns of spatial disadvantage there. So if we think about the kind of southwest Sydney attached to that kind of disadvantaged migrant cluster in those maps, but side by side to this new kind of more higher density city that emerges in the in-between spaces. So these emerging spaces can go. The last point, which I'll leave, and there will be more coming, just I guess not quite sure what they are yet, but ethnicity and migration status seems to be a really defining experience, have a defining role in the experiences of precarity. In different ways. So just migrant status alone, there are different migrant groupings within that seem to be really quite important. So where are we taking this? There's still more coming, but we're trying to still understand how these precarities overlap in space in particular. So more work around that kind of spatial manifestation of these four realms. We are doing interviews with millennials, I'm trying to understand their decision processes around housing and employment, and how, I guess, family goes together with those decisions. And then how wider policy actors actually might engage with these questions that are often been much more siloed, so the kind of housing policy questions and how that interfaces with labour markets and labour market changes and so on. So I'm going to hang it there. We've got a few minutes, I hope, for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, we do. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, either online or in the room, please fire away.
I'm curious about transport and the spatial. That this is just personal experience, but I don't drive, and there are many jobs that I might be going for that I can't drive to in the CBD without immense cost of car storage or whatever. And whether that gets teased out in anything, or whether you think that would be helpful for the narrative.
Yeah, it would be helpful. I mean, to be honest, we struggled with how to capture that spatial precarity measure, and link it to that place as opposed to it was difficult.
Possibly something that'll come out in the interviews.
Yes, we recognise that transport might be a key aspect of that. Yes, your access to job markets is going to be partly shaped by the kinds of transport you can access. So yes, it's not a perfect thing. Not quite sure is probably the answer. You got a suggestion?
Being able to afford a car.
Yeah, I mean, I was at SGS for a while, and the EJD, there's different versions of it depending on transport and stuff. Anyway, we can talk about it.
They do
a public transport one. I've made one before.
Okay.
Yeah. We take it offline.
Yeah.
Right, there you go. Back to you. So I'll go Ryan and then.
One pedantic question, one substantive question. The pedantic one, so when you had the sort of how you were like 1 out of 6, 2 out of 6, 3 out of 6, let me misunderstood what that metric is, but is the 0 out of 6 not considered? There seems to be like missing the second half.
Zero would be basically non-precarious, and there was a small group. Yeah, they've not shown.
That's what I mean, particularly when you're sort of comparing, you had some blue and some red.
Yeah.
Like columns, and I'm trying to like read the bell curve between them, and one's clearly going off the chart in one direction. So I just wanted to see that
zero is not shown, but yeah, your non-precarious would be sitting on the 0.
Yeah. But whether there's a difference between your red and your blue in those various.
Good pickup. 0 not shown. The score out of 100, and then the next step is we're running some sort of clustering analysis, trying to score each of the realms out of 100.
Yeah. So part of it is we're also interested in not just these people we might define as precarious, but those who actually are doing just fine here. Because I think this is part of it and like spatially it sort of emerges in those earlier maps. It's like actually there is a group here that are just fine.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of continuum. And where you might be, in an insecure job relatively, but you've got family wealth and you've got all kinds of other things, and you still own a house in, a well-located part of town. So you're doing fine in every other respect, but your job might not be as secure, or it might be high income, So it's trying to tease out how those fit together. So those zeros are important, and they're important to our.
Was that your substantive?
No, that was my pedantic one.
Substantive.
No, there's a standing question, which is sort of a similar question before. I was thinking less about transport and like the job density stuff.
Yeah.
And also what some of the stuff you were talking about earlier about that sort of post-war period. And basically I'm interested in like thinking about like the jobs geography that shifted. So like we sort of had suburban growth in a period where we also had a lot more suburban jobs growth. But we're now in a sort of post-industrial flyer economy, et cetera, and so that the job density or the spatial precarity measure is really just capturing the fact that we've seen this like loss of jobs on the outskirts, and so whether there's a disconnect there that like we're still sort of like pushing a housing model of suburban growth because that's the less precarious housing, but it's the more precarious economic. If you're like I don't.
Yeah.
I'm just open it as a sort of observation that. Like I'm clearly not saying anything you haven't said because you've included all that stuff, but how are you piecing that together basically to fit it?
Well, I guess the survey stuff that we're collecting is it's a moment in time as well. So the extent that you're using a kind of structure of the job market as it is now, it kind of goes together with that survey. How do you understand the dynamics that change through time? Yeah, that's a harder one.
And that's what we hope to ask in the interviews, is their trajectory of housing and job.
Because even the 2001, 2016, where you showed the job and tenure, like look at some jobs stuff in those two periods as well, like distance to work and stuff. 2001 versus
I mean, the thing that I'm interested in here is like, I mean, if you imagine that kind of continuous or more secure, long-running job or position, and then your decisions to become sort of spatially fixed in the city through home ownership, in a sense, as opposed to, say, the more precarious move around rental. So, the extent to which that rental kind of space emerges in response to changes in labour markets, because you don't know if you're going to be working at UNSW this year and Sydney next year and Macquarie the next year after that. So and are you going to structure your housing decisions in response to those uncertainties? That makes, we're still trying to work out how that
Spatial precarity, we need to think about that more. Good feedback.
Two questions or two comments, I suppose. Did you look at, in the Alan Kohler graph, for example, did you look at interest rates and the potential that had on the precariety of, all aspects of society in increasing the house prices? So does interest rates come into that?
In the comments of survey respondents under, why they were dissatisfied with their housing, or why the interest rates kept coming up as making it really hard to save for a deposit or pay off the mortgage. So
and even having access to finance and that sort of stuff.
I mean, it's trouble because we're always dealing with a snapshot in time.
Point in time now, it's topical.
It becomes hard to.
And the second part was the impact of climate change, and certainly in Western Sydney with the Heat Island impact, and also, we're seeing the flood impact around, those Hawkesbury Nepean sort of basin around Camden and that sort of stuff. Is that now a consideration with regards to
again, dissatisfaction with housing to a little extent? There were comments about very hot, no working air conditioner. Didn't come out in a big way. Obviously, the term precarity is now also being linked to climate change.
Maybe there should be a fifth environmental.
Simplify things.
I think so. But, I mean, the other part of this is, and this is expressed not just about environmental questions, but the element of choice in all of this. And this is something we want to explore more through the interviews. How much can people express those choices to, that spatial fix, move away from the hot places or move to the, more economically advantageous places, whether people can exercise those choices, whether they want to. Run some stuff on housing market demand areas, and it's like there's a kind of social dimension there too, and family connections, and why people might stay in a particular location. So I think, the choice constraint thing is a tricky one to get through.
Area of future research.
We have one question that's from online, and he's asking about religious indicators that may define precariety. For example, Islamophobia or the Muslim or other groups, they feel precarious to have the full freedom of exercising religious practices. So is there any comment you got on that in the precarious score?
No, I mean, we did ask about people's place of birth background. Well, actually, in terms of the survey, we only asked whether they were born in Australia or overseas. So we didn't differentiate between different regions of the world. Insofar as we used it from census, it again was just place of birth. So we didn't tie it to religion or people's feelings around security or precarity because of that. I guess you'd have to do that in probably a bit more qualitative way. I don't know even how people would respond to those sorts of questions in the survey, to be honest. But
Possibly come out in the interviews. I mean, the
It
fact
might
that
do.
there's a sort of migrant and precarity interaction may something possibly we should flesh out in the interviews.
I was going to ask something more or less related. That's right. Jumping in. Because when you first were talking about some of the migrant stuff, I'm like, oh, there's a racial precarity to it. But then you had these kind of two different groups that some were doing reasonably well and others weren't. And I mean, maybe in your ones that you can't get at this sort of stuff, but I just sort of wonder why is it that, people from different regions come with different levels of economic capital? Is it a social capital thing you talked about?
Yeah, we had too many charts, but
Yeah.
we have access to, obviously, immigration policy wasn't mentioned in this, but Australia's immigration policy since the 2000s is very much focused on skilled migration. So definitely it's related to visa stream. If you look at the net overseas migration by age profile, there's a peak in this 25 to 39 age group, and they're largely concentrated in the skilled migrant stream. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a huge cohort of Asian migrants coming in. But as both the cluster analysis and the survey show, there's diversity in typologies and where they come from, human. The outcomes, employment and housing outcomes that they experience post-migration. So,
yeah, it was just more a comment in terms of feeling, asking the people if they actually fear that they are in that kind of situation. Because I think there's a whole generation that maybe would simply say, the Australian dream is not my dream any longer. They may not want that block of land and nice little bungalow with no transport and 5 cars in front of the house to drive somewhere. They would probably much more say a nice little studio apartment that hardly exists, close to the airport, and I'm flying 5 times a year overseas and enjoy myself, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's another element in terms of long-term planning, if we are actually still planning for that generation.
Spot on. That's our question. One of the questions we asked the interviews is, what is the Australian dream? What does it mean to you?
Some other project I've worked on, there was a certain group of people that had basically thought, well, this dream, this thing about, mortgaged, indentured work and whatever, is too hard and it's just not possible. So actually, it's the whole avocado toast thing. Bugger it, you've just, your boomers have made the system too impossible. We're going to go off and have a good time instead. So rather than dedicate all their resources to something that's unachievable, they're going to pursue these other things in life. So I think there's a story here, but how much of it's kind of choice driven or whether they're just pushed into it is a big question. Chris?
Yeah, nice piece of research. Just wondering, within the scope of this research, or is that future research, because you talked about, policymakers and how they might reflect and start to look at the multi-dimensional aspects associated, which is really important. Are you asking any questions, or is this outside the scope to start to then, explore that policy space and potential solution space?
Well, we wanted to do this in this project was, dedicate a space to that kind of future-looking part of it. And so we will be doing some interviews with those sorts of policy, like not the usual housing actors, which I would go a bit off the side, and pose those kind of questions. But I'm not sure how much opportunity we will get in the end to go beyond that. But yeah, it's something we'd like to do in a more deliberative way about, well, okay, given this context, we're not going back to, the 1950s model, so how do we build a new model out of this that is perhaps more equal than it is now? But importantly, going back to that kind of welfare state dimension is, and the long-term implication of this, we have a kind of retirement welfare model that hinges on home ownership. And if in the absence of that, then, what are we going to replace that? How do we ensure that, we have wealth equality without home ownership? Because that's the big part of the rental security story, I think. Rental secure, but, you're going to be poor when you
get old and have to leave town anyway. But yes,
Watch this space. Okay, well, it's a bit after 5 already. So I'd like to thank Laurence and Rupa again for their presentation today. Just a reminder, we do run the seminar series every 2 weeks, and the next seminar will be on the 22nd of March with Charles Gillin, who'll be talking about New South Wales government architects. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.